Welcome to our panel discussion, Cloud Therapy from Real Life Experts. My name is Dan Garrity. I'm the SVP of Developer Services at Oracle and Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. I'm super excited to be here with our guests today. Tell you a little bit about myself just to kind of set the context. I've been a developer my whole life, mostly in startups, actually. Startups that were using the cloud or cloud-like services before I actually started developing for the cloud. I had one startup that some of you may know called Coinstar, and there we networked something like 30,000 kiosks. This was a little bit before the internet. Nonetheless, we faced all the same issues that cloud developers face today. I had an aviation navigation startup focused on GPS availability, that we had some resiliency challenges there. If we weren't available, the airlines couldn't fly. That was no fun. And then I spent about 5 years at AWS working on some high-scale systems there for their billing product. What I left there, we'd processed 1 quadrillion metering records in a month, or 1 times 10 to the 15th, about 400 million records per second. So I've got a little bit of experience with scale, a little bit of experience with trying to move applications into the cloud. But beyond my experience, now we have some real experts. We have with us Rolando Carrasco. He is the CTO of Services and Processes Solutions, a software development integrator based in Mexico City. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves in a few seconds here. Our second panelist, Manu Mukherjee, is the VP of Engineering at 8x8, and he looks after the AI, data, and analytics, which is incredibly important in both modern apps and also in his industry of telecommunications. And then finally, we have Cornelia Davis, who is the CTO of Weaveworks, which is a software development firm focused on cloud and open source technologies. I think more importantly, she's the author of a book called Cloud Native Patterns: Design, Change, Tolerant Software. With that, I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves and give a little bit more context about why they're here and what they'd like to talk about. So let's start with you, Rolando.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm very pleased to be here with you all. And yes, I'm Rolando Carrasco. I'm from Mexico. I am based here in Mexico City, and I am the CTO for this consulting firm. SPS is the name, and been working with Oracle technology and open source technology for a while, starting with the old days of Oracle Fusion middleware, and now with OCI and all the cloud native offering that Oracle has, and trying to make customers successful with their migrations or their movement to modern architectures. And so far, using OCI for that regard. And we are very excited with the offering of Oracle and trying to use the technology as much as possible in our projects. Thank you, Dan.
Fantastic. And Manu?
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me here. It's great to be here. My name's Manu Mukherjee. I'm the VP of Engineering for Analytics and AI and Data at 8x8. What I'm here to talk about is our journey for how we are going from on-prem to OCI and what we learned along the way.
Great. And then Cornelia, a few words about you.
Yes, super. Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Cornelia Davis. I am currently the CTO at Weaveworks. I have about a 3 decades long career as a computer scientist, was trained as a computer scientist, both kind of practical and theoretical. So I did theory of computing for a number of years and studied programming languages. But I think most relevant to the conversation today is I've spent about the last 10 years working on modern application platforms, so developer platforms, cloud-based developer platforms, both here at Weaveworks and in my prior gig at Pivotal, where I worked on Cloud Foundry and also on Kubernetes-based offerings. And as you said, I'm the author of Cloud Native Patterns as well.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. I think the whole sort of overarching concept of this whole Developer Live conference is really about simplifying the art or the act of building modern applications. And so I'm really interested in your perspectives on how you did that. So Rolando, you and I have talked, and at SPS, you've dealt with multiple clients that are trying to modernize both existing and build brand new rewards applications. And I know that you have recently completed one with a major retailer in the Americas, maybe one that we would be very familiar with in Seattle, at least. And I know that they were looking for sort of reliability or resilience, meaning if I want to do something with the application, it's going to happen. And they wanted to improve their scalability. But I think when I hear you talk, mostly they wanted to get some agility. So perhaps you can tell us about the technology choices that your customers make and how you lead them to the right technologies to modernize their existing and new applications.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. Yes, and this is a major branch that we all maybe used, even probably in a daily basis. They are based in Seattle, as Dan mentioned, and they had this need about recreating the rewards program. So the customers of this large company are very eager to use the rewards program because of the benefits they have. But the problem is that the business had a very bad experience on maintaining that previous rewards application, and then they couldn't scale. For example, they didn't have the agility to send the promotions at the time they wanted. They needed to ask for IT when was the right moment to send a specific promotion, when was the right moment to send a specific bunch of notifications to their customers. So they were trying to protect, if you will, the infrastructure instead of making the business even better. So that was the problem. And the business asked us to build something that can be scalable, that can be reliable, that can use the concepts of elasticity, and then they can move into a way that if in case they wanted to move into another region, because they have presence in different regions, that they can deploy the infrastructure pretty fast instead of doing it from scratch. So those were the type of things that the business were looking for. And at the end, in order to decide the technology to be used for this case, the principles were the relevant thing in order to take the next step on deciding the technology. So we were looking for principles like automation, elasticity, standards, constant change of the software and the deployment process, pay-per-use and the consumption of those services, and the predictability of the system itself. So on that regard, we were looking for a platform and technology that can use these principles. And we ended up with a mix of SaaS applications from Oracle, cloud native technology from Oracle, Kubernetes as well, and other PaaS applications from Oracle itself that I can mention maybe later on during the panel. But basically, in the technology side of the house, we were looking for these principles, and we fulfilled them using the cloud native technology offered by Oracle.
Okay, and I guess I just have to ask, I mean, you have a customer like this that obviously has a whole bunch of what you might call legacy applications installed maybe in a data center, and you just went to them and you said, okay, we're going to use Kubernetes and cloud native technologies. I mean, did you have any convincing to do for them to choose these technologies?
Definitely, and it was much more in the process of how we released the software, because they were very, how to say it, in Cornelia's book, I think she used this concept about making a ceremony every time they deploy a new version of the software, and they were very used on that one. So instead of having this automated, they were always having meetings midnight to 6 a.m. in the morning, and then checking that everything was okay. So that mind shift was one of the biggest challenges, because they felt that they have control if they do those kind of processes, and they lost control if they automate it. So that mind shift, it was a challenge for us.
Yeah. So, were there any resources that you could give your customer? Because you may have done the development, but ultimately the customer owns the system, so they have to be somewhat familiar with it. Were there resources that helped them simplify their applications? Resources that brought your developers closer to the solution that you provided?
I think yes, and I think one of those resources is this way of automating the packaging of the software and the deployment of the software, so they can see the entire chain of building the software and ultimately deploying it. So those type of tools, they have control. They have the ultimate control of that.
I
So
see.
they can deploy a new version. They can get back to a previous release. They can roll back it pretty fast. They can do this blue green deployment. So those type of things are the ones that they now have. They didn't have previously, and
I
that's the
see.
mind shift.
So it's really CI/CD and sort of, I mean, you're sort of teaching toward the cloud. If you're doing blue-green deployments, you really need that scalability to do that. I'm curious, Manu or Cornelia, let's start with you, Manu. Do you have some comments on this technology choice and resources that simplify?
In terms of the technology choice, I try to defer to uh, keep it simple and go with the core strengths of the team as the technology keeps evolving. So you want your general architecture to be able to support and evolve over time. I think some of the stuff I talk about is around how we were able to do it, and I think that'll give you more context.
Perfect. And Cornelia, I'm sure since you know so much about DevOps, I'm sure you have some perspective on this.
Yeah, so I think just very briefly, the comment that I would make is that I heard in Rolando's conversation there this tension between um, loss of control with automation and repeatability. And you talked, for example, about the ability to roll out into a new region very, very quickly. And the only way that you can do that is by fully automating things. And so helping an organization understand that, sure, the way that we've always done things is through clicky interfaces. And yes, you get a little bit uncomfortable when you start handing that over to some automation. That is really a shift that you have to make. So that's one observation I have.
Okay. Yeah, it's sort of non-optional in a sense. It's sort of
Yeah.
the foundation or the fundamental part of getting that agility at least, and the resiliency and the scalability. Uh, Manu, let's look at some of the things you're doing. I know at 8x8 you're heading up the analytics team and you're working on a pretty high-powered analytics application right now. And you've had some issues trying to implement this outside your own data centers, and you've built some nice workarounds around that, and you've got some pretty impressive results early on. Can you just, for the audience, maybe summarize the analytics app? And then I'm going to want to know about, any steps that you used to prep your dev team, particularly around people and processes.
Yeah, so as far as legacy applications go, this application is relatively new. It's a real-time analytics pipeline. The data comes in via Kafka. We process it using Storm, and then it's written to Elastic. And then there's an API and a web layer that sit on top of Elastic. So in the legacy application scale, it's relatively new, but we're having troubles with it already in being able to scale it out and burst it out. So I think for us, the main business drivers were currently the applications on-prem, and we don't have the elasticity to be able to scale it out. So and it's also in multiple geographies, so we needed a repeatable process that we can do across multiple locations. In order to do this, we wanted to do it without having any customer impact. So at a high level, we decided to fork the Kafka pipe and ingest it live in our new environment in OCI, along with the application running on-prem, and almost like a green-blue deployment, but across different clouds. So once we got that working, then we were able to do the cutover without any customer impact. I think, so the people and process and skills, I think the goal should always be to plan for this instead of trying to survive it as it's happening. It's always easier to think about these type of things ahead of time. So in our case, we did tests, we set up the VPN pipe between our data center and OCI in Phoenix. We did things like we went to Phoenix instead of the West Coast data center because there are more availability domains there, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of thinking that happens in the background. And once we were able to do it in one region, we had enough scripting and process to be able to replicate it. And that goes back to what Cornelia was saying, that there is no way to kind of do this manually without causing hiccups otherwise.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring up that point. You know, a lot of us developers are quite used to having sort of code as code. I'm kind of moving into an analogy, right, where people are talking about, well, you have to have code as code, you have to have infrastructure as code. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing from both you and Rolando is that you also need to have config as code, because both of you have said, oh, by the way, once we finish this in region A, we're going to need to replicate this in region B. And I'm not sure everyone always thinks about that at the beginning. So sort of this automation, the DevOps, config as code, these are quite important. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like some of the things that you had to work with your team, some of the new processes and new ways of thinking center around that. I'm interested, Rolando, do you have anything to add to what Manu said?
I wanted just to make an extra comment around this scenario, and it is the API approach, but I think it is related with what we've been talking during the past minutes. And we had that approach as well for them because they have multiple systems that they need to integrate or interoperate, the POS, the mobile application, the web application, and so on. So there is no way to get into those systems if you don't think about an API. And then it is just the rollout of the API, and everybody can just get plugged into that. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Okay. And I think one thing that you may have heard during the conference, and I think my colleagues back in Seattle are laughing at me for saying this, but you know, an API gateway that's inserted at the very front of your project can help you immensely in this regard, because not only can it be used to create and replicate existing APIs, but then after your project is up, it can be used to direct traffic. So in Manu's case, either to the green fleet or the blue fleet, depending on how you'd like to do that. And then it can also provide governance, and it can provide a consistent API facade for all of your different regions. So that's another interesting point that this is driving. Cornelia, you've written a lot about processes and mindsets that have to change in developers in order to modernize. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, so I would like to add one thing that may not seem quite so obvious, but we've been talking about repeatability. We've been talking about automation. You brought up some really great points of infrastructure as code and config as code. Now, all of those things only work if you are doing things quite strictly. That is, you are not creating drift in your environments. So if your automation only works from a repeatability perspective, if you know that that automation is going to create a state that's exactly the same as where you started over here. So this is another really important thing to do, is to ensure that there are no opportunities for drift to be introduced into your deployments. Or if that drift is introduced, that it's immediately detected and either automatically corrected, or at least somebody's notified of that. And so that, I think, is an important, very subtle element, is that, sure, the scripts that you write, you can repeatably run those, but you need to make sure that you haven't drifted from that state.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair comment, and one that we hadn't talked about before. And I think, at least in our business, engineers, developers, coders, people are human. And, I don't think I've ever heard of an environment where there is absolutely no drift. I mean, people make mistakes, people reach out and tweak something, they push a branch, they will introduce drift. And so the key thing that you said there is detecting the drift and being able to mitigate any potential harmful effects from drift. So I agree. I think we're all saying the same thing, is that really foundationally, it starts with a DevOps automation. Code is code, infrastructure is code, config is code, make it repeatable, make it resilient. So great comments on that. Cornelia, you have industry recognition as an expert really on cloud native patterns and this sort of resilience. And what if you had to give the top 3 activities that dev teams should undertake, what would those be? What are the top 3 things dev teams need to do to make all this stuff work?
Yeah, so I mean, being third in line here, we've already touched upon a couple of them. So let me maybe try to summarize some of those things. The first one that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about yet is software architecture itself. And that's, in fact, what I wrote my book about. And I think it's really interesting that we're using the term simplify. And if those of you who are listening haven't already listened to Rich Hickey, Rich Hickey is the creator of Closure. If you haven't listened to Rich Hickey talk about simple and complex, I welcome you to go out and Google that. He does a really great job around that. And what he talks about there is that simple is really about kind of disentangling things. Complex is when things are intertwined and entangled. And that is the way that that's one of the benefits of having been in this gig for 30 years, is that I was there when we were heavily entangling our software. And what we've done in more recent times is we have disentangled that. We've created individual microservices. We've been very, very strict about making sure that those stay disentangled and that we have clean ways. Dan, you mentioned things like API gateways. So just the API way of designing things and having technology that supports that, I think, is important. So number 1 is really focus on that software architecture. That really helps to simplify things. Number 2 is, we've used the term DevOps, and there's something important about DevOps that I want to point out here. And that is that I believe that, and I think the industry has proven this correct, is that there's an important element to DevOps, which is that of platform. And I think both Rolando and Manu have mentioned platform and have mentioned specifically the Oracle platform and various elements of that. But around the notion of platform, we want to organize those teams. So what we want is we want a team that's responsible for the platform and a team that are the consumers. They're responsible for the customer-facing applications. So I like to call those the application team and the platform team. And that's a very, very important key element of DevOps, because what the platform team does is they give you enough capabilities to the application teams for them to be able to develop and operate their own customer-facing applications. Develop and operate. They're not operating infrastructure, but they're operating their applications. And so it's this kind of repartitioning. We used to partition along stages in the software development lifecycle. Now we're partitioning on who's responsible for the platform and who's responsible for the apps that are running on that. So I think that is a second element, which is this whole, the way to think about DevOps and this partitioning of platforms and apps. And then the third thing we've touched upon as well, which is to really rethink deployment. Rolando said it at the beginning, is this notion of deployments used to have this major ceremony. We only did them every 6 months or every year or something like that. We need to eliminate that notion of that being a major event, and it needs to be a shrug. Yeah, I did a deployment. Well, what that means is that we need to put some safety nets in place. And we touched upon one of them, blue-green or canary deployments. There's a term that that is gaining popularity, which is around progressive deployment. And so it's not only a progressive deployment from, okay, we do a blue-green and now blue is offline as green is online. Increasingly having multiple versions running at the same time, so we can analyze which one is doing better. Manu, I think you mentioned something about that as well. And you mentioned about forking, the feed in Kafka, which I think is really cool. We can use that to, again, leverage these progressive deployments. So those are the three top things I would think of: is architecture, platform teams, platform and app teams, and really rethinking the way that you do deployments.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice and well summarized. So, Manu, do you have any thoughts on that quickly?
No, I think I agree with all of those. I mean, that was kind of our approach on how we did this. There were some hiccups, right, as you can imagine. So I don't think going in, we should think any of this is doable without hiccups. So in our case, we were trying to use Spark 3.0 streaming, and it wasn't quite supported in OCI, and we were able to work on creating our own Kubernetes cluster on OKE. So that gives us additional flexibility. But I think the main point there is to use applications and architectures that make it possible to be a little agile on these plans, so you can mitigate them instead of saying, oh, now we have to go back and rewrite this 6-month project, right?
Perfect. Okay, Rolando, any closing thoughts?
Yes, I think also on top of the technology, we also have some challenges on how we organize teams. And sometimes the project just starts and people does not understand exactly what they need to build. They do not identify which are the tools or the platforms they need to get access to, for example. So maybe this is obvious, but at the same time, this is going to put you a break if you don't take care of this beforehand. And also the project discipline on how you measure the progress of the software that you are building. So how you really get into that and how you progress, and then how do you report that progress to your management, for example. I think that's also key in order to keep things clear to the business. And also the one that I just mentioned before, which is the API first approach. I think that's also a key thing for whoever is designing and creating the APIs and whoever is consuming those APIs, because the API first approach is going to give you this parallel access to the teams in order to create the pieces they are in charge of, but in parallel, instead of waiting for someone to give you the API and then you just start building. So I think also those three things and the first two that I just mentioned are just more on the discipline on how you produce your software and how you organize your team. So also keep that in mind.
Perfect. Well, I believe we are at time. I want to thank our panelists. It's been incredibly informative and useful, and I think I learned a lot, and I'm hoping you did as well. So thank you for tuning in to our panel discussion. Thank you.